Picture a Cretaceous floodplain under a hot Texas sky, long before grasslands, highways, ranch fences, or human maps. The land is open in places, wooded in others, crossed by channels, shallow lakes, and dry ground that holds the tracks of animals we will never see alive. A herd of dinosaurs moves in the distance, heavy bodies shifting through heat shimmer. Smaller creatures keep low in the vegetation. Insects rise from the water. Then a shadow passes across the ground. Not the shadow of a dragon, not a bird, and not a dinosaur, but something stranger, a flying reptile with a neck like a crane, limbs like stilts, a long toothless beak, and wings that could stretch wider than a small airplane. When it stands, its head may reach the height of a giraffe. When it opens its wings, the animal seems almost impossible. This is Quetzalcoatlus, one of the most famous giant pterosaurs in the fossil record. It has become a prehistoric icon because it sounds like a contradiction. A giraffe-sized flying reptile should not feel possible. We can understand eagles. We can understand bats. We can understand small birds launching from a branch. But an animal as tall as a modern giraffe, with a wingspan around 10 to 12 meters in common estimates, challenges our instincts about flight. We look at it and ask the question that has followed Quetzalcoatlus since its discovery. How could something that large ever leave the ground? The answer begins with clearing away the myths. Quetzalcoatlus was not a dinosaur. It lived at the same time as some late Cretaceous dinosaurs, and it shared landscapes with them, but it belonged to a different group of reptiles called pterosaurs. Pterosaurs were the first vertebrates to evolve powered flight. They appeared long before birds became dominant in the sky, and they built wings in a way no living animal repeats exactly. A bird wing is built from feathers and a modified forelimb. A bat wing is built from skin stretched across long fingers. A pterosaur wing was built mainly from a skin and muscle membranes supported by a dramatically lengthened fourth finger, while the other fingers remained small and usable near the front of the wing. That difference matters because if we imagine Quetzalcoatlus as a bird, we will misunderstand it. If we imagine it as a dragon, we will leave science entirely. Pterosaurs were real animals with real anatomy, real limits, and real evolutionary history. They were not monsters designed for fantasy. Their bones were often hollow and lightweight, but not weak. Their bodies were shaped by the demands of flight, walking, feeding, launching, and surviving in ecosystems full of competition. Quetzalcoatlus was not magic. It was biology stretched near the edge of what flying vertebrates can do. The fossils come from the Javelina Formation of Big Bend National Park in Texas, rocks from the very end of the Cretaceous. The original giant species, Quetzalcoatlus northropi, is famous partly because it is so huge and partly because it is frustratingly incomplete. We do not have a perfect skeleton laid out like a museum diagram. The largest form is known from partial material, especially wing bones, while a smaller form, now called Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, is represented by much more abundant remains. Paleontologists have used the smaller species and related Ashdarkid pterosaurs to reconstruct the proportions of the giant. That means every serious image of Quetzalcoatlus is a scientific reconstruction, not a photograph in bone. This uncertainty is not a weakness of paleontology. It is the normal condition of studying deep time. Fossils are broken, scattered, biased, and rare. The job is not to pretend we know everything. The job is to use anatomy, comparison, geology, and physics to narrow the possibilities. For Quetzalcoatlus, the broad picture is strong. It was a giant Ashdarkid pterosaur from the late Cretaceous of North America, one of the largest animals ever to fly. The details, including exact mass, exact posture, launch mechanics, and feeding behavior, are still discussed and refined. Its size alone creates a strange image. On the ground, Quetzalcoatlus would not have looked like a giant bat crawling awkwardly, and it would not have looked like a bird hopping on two legs. Ashdarkid pterosaurs appear to have been capable quadrupeds, walking on both their hind limbs and folded forelimbs. Their forelimbs were not useless wings dragging along the ground. They were part of the animal's walking system. Trackways attributed to large pterosaurs show four-limbed movement, and Ashdarkid anatomy suggests that these animals were far more comfortable on land than older images of helpless, cliff-bound pterosaurs once implied. A standing Quetzalcoatlus would have seemed almost architectural. The body was not huge in the way a rhinoceros is huge. Much of the apparent height came from long limbs and a long neck. The torso was relatively compact. The head and beak were enormous but built lightly. The neck was long and stiff compared with many animals, not a swan-like rope twisting in every direction. The wings, folded at the sides, would have made the forelimbs look like strange walking poles. It would have had the presence of a stilted, alert, terrestrial animal, not just a creature waiting for a breeze. That is one of the most important changes in how scientists and artists now imagine giant Ashdarkids. Older visions often placed big pterosaurs near cliffs or coastlines, soaring like giant seabirds, snatching fish, or skimming the surface of water. Some of those ideas came from comparing them too closely with living birds. But Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives do not look well designed for skimming like modern skimmers. Their necks, jaws, limb proportions, and overall anatomy have led many researchers to favor a different picture. A terrestrial stalking animal, walking through open habitats or near waterways, picking up small prey from the ground, perhaps taking small vertebrates, invertebrates, or other available foods depending on species and habitat. This does not mean we know every meal it ate. We do not have a video of Quetzalcoatlus hunting. We do not have a neat stomach content list for the giant species. What we have are bones, environments, comparisons, and functional clues. The smaller Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni is associated with shallow lake deposits and may have fed around aquatic habitats. The giant Quetzalcoatlus northropy is rarer and may have been more solitary, perhaps tied to riparian or open inland settings. The best modern answer is cautious. Quetzalcoatlus was likely not a dragon-like aerial predator carrying off large dinosaurs, and it was probably not simply a giant seabird. It may have spent a great deal of time on the ground, using its height, long neck, and pointed beak to search for manageable prey. The comparison often used is not an eagle, but a stork or ground hornbill, scaled into something almost unreal. Imagine an animal striding slowly, scanning the ground from a high vantage point, then lowering a long head to seize a lizard, a small mammal, a hatchling, an amphibian, a fish near a drying pool, or a large insect. That is an illustrative reconstruction, not a claim about a specific observed event. The point is ecological. A giant Ashdarkid did not need to be a monster to be formidable. At that size, with that reach, it could dominate small prey simply by walking. But then we return to the central question. How could it fly? Flight is expensive. It demands lift, power, control, and launch. For small animals, takeoff can be quick. A pigeon jumps and flaps. A bat drops or leaps. A sparrow springs from a branch. For an animal the size of Quetzalcoatlus, the problem becomes much more severe. Large bodies scale differently. Mass increases faster than muscle cross-sectional area. Wings must carry weight, but bones must remain light enough for flight and strong enough to resist forces. Launch is especially difficult because the animal must accelerate from the ground into the air before the wings can fully do their work. For a long time, some researchers doubted whether the largest pterosaurs could fly at all. That doubt is understandable. If you imagine Quetzalcoatlus trying to take off like a giant heron, running on hind legs and flapping, the scene seems almost impossible. The hind limbs alone may not be enough to launch such a heavy animal into the air safely. But pterosaurs were not birds. They had powerful forelimbs, and those forelimbs were already involved in walking. This opened the door to a different launch model. Quadrupedal launch, where the animal uses all four limbs, especially the strong forelimbs, to vault itself into the air. In this model, a giant pterosaur does not run like a crane. It crouches, loads its limbs, and pushes powerfully off the ground, with the forelimbs acting almost like vaulting poles. Once airborne, the wings begin the first strong downstrokes. This idea helps explain how very large pterosaurs might have crossed the launch barrier. It uses the parts of the body that were already most associated with flight power, the forelimbs and shoulder region. There are debates about details, and some researchers have explored other takeoff models. But quadrupedal launch remains one of the most influential explanations for how giant pterosaurs could get airborne. Think about how different that makes the animal from a bird. A bird's main launching power often comes from the hind limbs, followed by wing beats. A pterosaur's wing finger and forelimb architecture allowed a different style. If Quetzalcoatlus launched with a four-limbed vault, then it was not just a flyer that happened to walk. It was an integrated machine, with walking limbs, flight limbs, and launching limbs all overlapping in a way no modern animal exactly matches. That is part of why pterosaurs feel so alien. They are not impossible, they are unfamiliar. Once in the air, Quetzalcoatlus probably did not fly like a hummingbird or flap continuously like a small bird fighting through thick vegetation. Its wings would have been suited for soaring and efficient travel, using air currents when possible. Large wings can generate lift, but the cost of continuous flapping for a giant animal is high. The most plausible image is a powerful launch, bursts of flapping when needed, and long periods of gliding or soaring in suitable conditions. Warm Cretaceous landscapes, open environments, and rising air over heated ground could have helped large pterosaurs move efficiently across distance. This does not mean we should imagine Quetzalcoatlus effortlessly circling the entire planet every afternoon. Long-distance flight has been proposed for giant pterosaurs, and some models suggest impressive soaring potential, but exact capabilities depend on assumptions about mass, wing shape, metabolism, weather, and behavior. A careful documentary should say that Quetzalcoatlus was likely capable of flight and may have been an efficient soarer, not that it had supernatural range or airplane-like certainty. The animal was real, and real animals live within limits. Those limits make it more impressive, not less. Fantasy creatures ignore physics. Quetzalcoatlus had to obey physics and still managed to exist. It had to be light enough, strong enough, efficient enough, and behaviorally adapted enough to launch, fly, land, walk, feed, and reproduce. Every part of its body was a compromise. A longer wing improves lift but affects control and launch. A lighter bone helps flight but must resist stress. A long neck helps feeding and vision but changes balance. A huge beak increases reach but must remain light. Evolution does not build perfect machines. It builds workable bodies from inherited parts. Landing may have been as important as takeoff. An animal this large could not simply crash into the ground and shake it off. It needed control, slowing ability, and a way to transition from flight to quadrupedal posture. Pterosaurs likely landed using coordinated limbs and wing movements, perhaps touching down with forelimbs and hind limbs in a controlled sequence. We should be humble here because landing behavior is hard to reconstruct. But the point is clear: being able to fly once is not enough. A flying animal must take off, remain stable, maneuver, land, and do it repeatedly without breaking itself. Quetzalcoatlus was not a stunt. It was a living species. The skull and beak add another layer of strangeness. Quetzalcoatlus had no teeth. Its long jaws formed a spear-like or forceps-like structure, not a crushing mouthful of serrated blades. That matters for its ecology. It was not built to chew large prey. It likely swallowed manageable items whole or in large pieces, depending on what it caught. The long beak could reach down without moving the entire body much, useful for picking items from the ground or shallow water. The head may have looked enormous, but pterosaur skulls were often full of openings and light construction, reducing weight while maintaining shape. The neck was also remarkable, as darked neck vertebrae were elongated and stiffened. This does not suggest a flexible snake-necked predator whipping its head around in every direction. It suggests a long, strong, relatively stiff beam, useful for reach, height, and controlled movements. In life, that neck would have helped Quetzalcoatlus look over vegetation, scan surroundings, and bring the beak down toward food. It also made the animal visually unforgettable. A giant pterosaur on the ground was not just wings. It was a walking tower. The wings themselves were not naked sheets like cheap movie membranes. Pterosaur wings were complex biological structures with fibers, blood vessels, muscles, and sensitivity. The wing membrane likely attached along the body and limbs in a way that supported controlled flight, though exact reconstructions vary among pterosaur groups. The outer part of the wing was supported by that long fourth finger, while the inner wing connected with the arm and body. Pterosaurs were covered, at least in many forms, with hair-like filaments called pycnofibers, suggesting insulation and active metabolism. Quetzalcoatlus was not a cold, leathery kite. It was an active vertebrate with a highly specialized flight apparatus. This is why calling pterosaurs dinosaurs is more than a small mistake. Dinosaurs and pterosaurs are relatives within the broader archosaur branch of reptiles, but they are not the same group. Dinosaurs include animals such as Triceratops, Tyrannosaurus, sauropods, hadrosaurs, and birds. Pterosaurs are a separate flying reptile lineage. They lived alongside dinosaurs for much of the Mesozoic, but they had their own evolutionary story. If dinosaurs were the great experiment in land dominance, and birds became the surviving flying dinosaurs, pterosaurs were another experiment. reptiles that took to the air before birds and reached sizes no bird ever matched. Why did pterosaurs become so large? Part of the answer may be ecological opportunity. Pterosaurs occupied aerial niches for more than 150 million years. They ranged from small forms to giants. By the late Cretaceous, many known pterosaurs were relatively large, and azhdarchids were among the most spectacular. Birds were also present, but many late Cretaceous birds occupied smaller-bodied niches. Giant pterosaurs may have dominated certain large-bodied flying or terrestrial stalking roles that birds did not fill. The end Cretaceous extinction removed pterosaurs completely, while some birds survived, leaving birds as the only flying dinosaurs and the dominant flying vertebrates of the Cenozoic. In Quetzalcoatlus, size may have offered advantages on the ground as much as in the air. A tall animal could see over vegetation. It could cover ground with long strides. It could reach prey or carry an inaccessible to smaller animals. It could intimidate competitors simply by being large. It could travel between feeding areas by flight, crossing distances that purely terrestrial animals could not. This combination makes azhdarchids especially intriguing. They were not just aerial specialists, and they were not just walkers. They were creatures that linked ground and sky. Imagine watching one move across a Cretaceous plain. Again, this is an illustrative reconstruction. It plants one forelimb, then a hind limb, then shifts forward with a deliberate gait. Its folded wings form angular supports. Its head tilts, not with mammalian facial expression, but with alertness. Small animals freeze. A hatchling in the wrong place would be in danger. A lizard breaking cover might vanish in one downward jab. Then, perhaps after feeding, the animal turns into the wind, lowers its body, loads its limbs, and launches. The impossible shape becomes airborne. The walking tower becomes a wing. That transformation is what makes Quetzalcoatlus so powerful as a documentary subject. It forces us to connect anatomy with behavior. The bones are not museum objects. They are clues to motion. A huge humerus is not only a bone, it is a record of forces. A long neck is not only a measurement, it is a feeding strategy. A wing finger is not only a strange digit, it is the frame of a flight surface. A fossil locality is not only a spot on a map, it is a lost habitat. When we bring those clues together, the animal becomes less like a monster and more like a solved problem that is still partly unsolved. There is also a deeper lesson in its name. Quetzalcoatlus was named after Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity of Mesoamerican tradition. The name fits the animal's grandeur, but it can also mislead if we let mythology take over. The real Quetzalcoatlus did not breathe fire, carry people, or behave like a fantasy mount. It was not a dragon waiting for a rider. It was an animal in a food web. It grew, fed, avoided danger, reproduced, and died. Its magnificence comes not from being mythical, but from being real. The late Cretaceous world of Texas was not an empty stage for one giant. The Javelina Formation preserves a broader ecosystem, including dinosaurs such as Alamosaurus and other vertebrates known from the region. The landscape was influenced by rivers, floodplains, and local water bodies. The exact habitats varied across the formation, and the fossils of Quetzalcoatlus are not all found in the same kind of deposit. The smaller species appears associated with shallow lake settings, while the giant species is rarer and has been found in channel deposits. That distribution has been used to suggest different habits or habitat preferences, though the evidence is not complete enough for absolute certainty. This environmental context is important because a flying animal is not only defined by the sky. It must land somewhere. It must feed somewhere. It must nest somewhere, though Quetzalcoatlus nests are not known. It must deal with storms, predators, competitors, droughts, and seasonal or local changes. If we only imagine it soaring against clouds, we miss most of its life. Even the greatest flying animals spend much of their time not flying. They stand, walk, rest, feed, interact, and grow. Quetzalcoatlus was as much a terrestrial animal as an aerial one. Could it prey on dinosaurs? That question is popular because it creates an instant image. A giant pterosaur stalking baby dinosaurs. The cautious answer is that it may have been able to take small animals, including small dinosaurs or hatchlings if available, but it was not a giant eagle built to seize adult dinosaurs in its talons. Pterosaurs did not have bird-like talons designed for carrying heavy prey in the same way raptors do. Azhdarchids likely used their beaks to pick up manageable food items. The size of prey would be limited by the skull, jaws, throat, and handling ability. So yes, small vertebrates may have been on the menu. No, It was not kidnapping Triceratops, was it a scavenger? Possibly at times, as many large animals will scavenge when the opportunity appears. But a pure scavenger model is difficult to support as the whole story. A giant pterosaur could exploit carrion, but its anatomy does not require it to be only a scavenger. Was it a predator? Likely in the sense of taking small prey. Was it a wader? The smaller species may have had associations with lake environments, but the giant species may not have been simply a giant heron. The most realistic answer is flexible. Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives were probably opportunistic foragers, with terrestrial stalking an important model, and with different species using different habitats. The danger in popular paleontology is turning uncertainty into fake certainty. We want clean labels: predator, scavenger, fisher, wader, sky king. Nature is messier. Living animals rarely obey documentary categories perfectly. Storks eat frogs, insects, fish, reptiles, small mammals, carrion, and whatever else fits. Herons are hunters but also opportunists. Ground hornbills stalk through grass and take many kinds of prey. If modern animals are flexible, extinct animals likely were too. Quetzalcoatlus did not need one job title. It needed enough food to survive. Its flight ability also deserves that same flexible thinking. Could it launch from flat ground? Many researchers argue giant pterosaurs were capable of launching from land, especially under quadrupedal launch models. Did it need cliffs? Probably not as a strict requirement. Could it fly in all weather? No animal can. Did juveniles fly differently from adults? Almost certainly, though details are debated across pterosaurs. Did adults flap constantly? Probably not. Could they soar efficiently? Likely, given wing size and flight modeling. Every answer should be framed as biology, not spectacle. One reason Quetzalcoatlus feels so alien is that no modern animal fills the same role. The largest living flying birds, such as albatrosses and condors, are impressive, but they are far smaller. Bats use membrane wings, but no bat approaches this scale. Giraffes are tall, but they do not fly. Storks stalk, but not with wings that span a small aircraft. Quetzalcoatlus combines traits that modern categories keep separate. That makes reconstruction difficult, but also fascinating. It reminds us that the present is not a complete guide to the past. The Cretaceous sky itself would have been different. Pterosaurs shared airspace with birds, but the balance of aerial life was not modern. There were no airplanes, no power lines, no cities, no human noise. Wind moved over warm floodplains and shallow lakes. Thermals rose from sunlit ground. Large pterosaurs may have used those invisible structures in the air the way soaring birds do today. To understand Quetzalcoatlus, we have to imagine not just the animal, but the air it lived in. Flight is always an animal-environment partnership. The end of Quetzalcoatlus came with the end Cretaceous mass extinction, the same event that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs. Pterosaurs as a group vanished at that boundary. Birds survived, but pterosaurs did not. Why? Their late diversity, ecological roles, reproductive biology, and vulnerability to food web collapse are all part of ongoing study. Large pterosaurs may have been especially exposed to the collapse of ecosystems after the Chicxulub impact. But we should avoid saying they were already failures waiting to disappear. Quetzalcoatlus was living near the end of the Cretaceous, but it was not an obsolete animal. It was a specialized, successful creature in its own world until that world changed. That is one of the themes that makes prehistoric life so moving. We often look backward with the ending already in mind. We call an animal the last of its kind, a doomed giant, a creature before extinction. But Quetzalcoatlus did not live as a symbol of the end. It lived as part of a functioning ecosystem. It walked, launched, flew, fed, and reproduced before the boundary. The asteroid did not reveal that pterosaurs were impossible. It interrupted a world where they were possible. A good Quetzalcoatlus story should therefore avoid two extremes. One extreme turns it into fantasy. A dragon, a monster, a creature carrying humans through the sky. The other reduces it to dry measurements: wingspan, femur, humerus, vertebrae, mass estimate. The real animal lives between those extremes. It is scientifically grounded and visually astonishing. It is a biomechanical puzzle with a shadow wide enough to startle the imagination. It deserves wonder, but wonder with discipline. That discipline begins with words. Pterosaur, not dinosaur. Flying reptile, not bird. Ashdarkid, not generic prehistoric monster. Likely terrestrial stalker, not guaranteed dragon predator. One of the largest flying animals, not a creature with unlimited flight powers. as tall as a giraffe in the sense of standing height estimates, not literally a giraffe with wings. Every phrase can either sharpen the truth or blur it. In paleontology, the truth is already strange enough. What made Ashdarkids so strange was the full package. They had enormous skulls, long necks, toothless beaks, long limbs, capable ground movement, and wings that could carry them through the air. They were not simply scaled-up versions of earlier pterosaurs. They represented a late, specialized branch of pterosaur evolution that explored a body plan unlike anything alive today. Their fossils are often fragmentary, which makes them mysterious. But the pattern is clear enough to show an animal that broke our modern expectations. When you look at a Quetzalcoatlus skeleton mount, the first reaction is disbelief. The neck is too long, the head seems too large, the forelimbs seem too strange, the wings are too wide. But disbelief is not an argument. Evolution has produced many bodies that look impossible until we understand the rules behind them. A sauropod neck, a whale body, a bat wing, a hummingbird metabolism, a giraffe circulation system, an elephant trunk, all are strange solutions to real problems. Quetzalcoatlus belongs in that category. It is not a violation of biology. It is one of biology's most extreme solutions. The body mass question remains one of the hardest parts. Estimates for giant pterosaurs have varied widely over the decades. Too light, and the animal becomes unrealistic because muscles, organs, and bones need mass. Too heavy, and flight becomes difficult. Many modern estimates place Quetzalcoatlus northropi in the range of a few hundred kilograms, but the exact number depends on reconstruction assumptions. That uncertainty should make us cautious with claims about speed, range, and launch. A difference in mass can change flight calculations significantly. This is why serious reconstructions often speak in ranges and probabilities rather than absolute numbers. But the debate itself is revealing. It shows that paleontology is not just naming creatures. It is testing extinct life against physics. Could the bones resist stress? Could the muscles generate power? Could the wing produce lift? Could the animal feed enough to support flight? Could it land safely? These questions connect fossils to engineering, anatomy, ecology, and climate. Quetzalcoatlus is not just a celebrity fossil. It is a research problem standing on four limbs. The public loves the phrase largest flying animal, but that phrase carries complexity. Some other giant pterosaurs, such as Hatzegopteryx and Arenbergiana, may have rivaled it in size. Fragmentary fossils make rankings difficult. Quetzalcoatlus remains one of the best-known and most iconic supergiant pterosaurs, but the title of absolute largest is not as simple as a leaderboard. In science, the more honest phrase is often one of the largest flying animals known. That is still extraordinary. We do not need to exaggerate it into certainty. Its cultural power comes from scale. When people hear wingspan numbers, they understand size intellectually. When they hear giraffe height, they feel it. A creature standing eye to eye with a giraffe and then taking flight seems to cross a boundary between the familiar and the impossible. That is why it works so well for a documentary hook. But the hook must lead into explanation. If the video only says giant flying reptile over and over, it becomes empty. The real fascination is how that body worked. So how could Quetzalcoatlus fly? Not like a bird, not like a bat, and not like a machine, but like a pterosaur. It likely used a powerful launch, probably involving its forelimbs in a quadrupedal vault, according to one major model. It had a lightweight but strong skeleton, large wings, and an anatomy evolved for aerial movement. It probably used soaring to reduce energy costs. It lived in environments where open space and air currents could make large flight practical. Its body was a compromise between ground feeding and aerial travel. It did not break the laws of physics. It used a different set of biological tools. How did it walk? Probably with a quadrupedal gait, using folded wings as forelimbs and moving more competently on the ground than old reconstructions suggested. Its limbs were long and placed to support a tall posture. It was not crawling helplessly. It was not waddling like an overloaded bird. It was a strange but functional walker, perhaps covering ground efficiently while searching for food. That ground competence is central to understanding Ashdarkids. They were not trapped in the sky. They belonged to the land as well. What did it eat? The safest answer is small prey and other manageable foods, likely captured while walking or foraging in suitable habitats, with possible differences between species. It may have taken small vertebrates, invertebrates, and aquatic prey where available. It may have scavenged opportunistically. It probably did not carry large dinosaurs away. It probably did not skim the ocean like an oversized skimmer. Its beak, neck, and limb proportions fit a more grounded foraging model than the old sea skimmer fantasy. Why were pterosaurs not dinosaurs? Because they split from a related but separate archosaur lineage. They were flying reptiles, not members of Dinosauria. Birds are dinosaurs, pterosaurs are not. This difference is not trivia. It changes how we understand flight evolution. Powered flight evolved at least 3 times in vertebrates: pterosaurs, birds, and bats. Each group solved the same basic problem in a different anatomical way. Quetzalcoatlus belongs to the earliest of those great experiments, the pterosaur experiment, which ended at the close of the Cretaceous. Why were Ashdarkids so strange? Because they combined giant size, flight, terrestrial ability, long-necked foraging, and lightweight construction at a scale that no living animal repeats. They remind us that evolution does not have to produce familiar shapes. It can produce a walking aircraft with a giraffe-height head and a beak like a spear. It can produce a creature equally at home, striding across a floodplain and lifting into a thermal. It can produce an animal that looks impossible until the bones explain the logic. In the end, Quetzalcoatlus is not fascinating because it was a monster. It is fascinating because it was real. Real enough to leave bones in Texas rock. Real enough to force arguments about mass, wings, launch, walking, and habitat. Real enough to remind us that the Cretaceous was not only a world of dinosaurs on land, but also a world of reptiles that mastered the air in ways birds never would. The skies above the last dinosaur ecosystems were not empty. They were crossed by animals that make our modern world feel small. Imagine that shadow one more time, sliding over a Cretaceous plain. Below it, dinosaurs move through the heat. In the distance, water flashes. The giant pterosaur lowers its head, steps forward on long limbs, then opens wings that seem too wide for an animal standing on land. It is not a dragon. It is not a dinosaur. It is not a bird. It is Quetzalcoatlus, a living solution to the problem of being enormous and airborne, one of the strangest giants Earth ever placed in the sky. One of the easiest ways to underestimate Quetzalcoatlus is to picture it only at the moment of flight. Flight is dramatic, but it is not the whole life of a flying animal. Modern albatrosses are famous for soaring, yet they must nest, molt, feed, defend space, and rest. Condors are built for the air, but they spend important time on cliffs and ground. Bats fly at night, but they also roost, crawl, groom, and raise young. A pterosaur the size of Quetzalcoatlus would have faced the same truth in a more extreme body. Every flight had to be worth the energy. Every landing had to bring it back to a place where it could do ordinary animal things. That ordinary life is hard to reconstruct because fossils preserve bones better than behavior. We do not know what sounds Quetzalcoatlus made. We do not know its colors. We do not know whether the giant species gathered in groups or mostly lived alone. We do not know exactly how it nested, how fast it grew, or how juveniles moved through the world. The smaller species from Big Bend has been found in numbers that suggest social or gregarious behavior around shallow lake settings. But the giant species is much rarer. It is tempting to fill every gap with cinematic certainty, but a better reconstruction leaves some space open. Mystery is not failure. It is part of deep time. Color is one of those mysteries. Popular art often paints Quetzalcoatlus in gray, brown, red, black, or pale desert tones, but we do not have a definitive color pattern for it. Pterosaurs may have had complex coverings, and some fossils of other pterosaurs preserve soft tissues. But Quetzalcoatlus itself does not give us a complete skin and color map. A documentary can show plausible colors inspired by living large birds, reptiles, or habitat camouflage, but it should not present those colors as known facts. The same applies to display structures and social behavior. A crest, a posture, or a dramatic courtship scene can be visually appealing, but without evidence it remains an artistic choice. Growth is another fascinating question. If Quetzalcoatlus hatched from eggs like other reptiles and pterosaurs, then at some point the sky giant began as a small animal vulnerable to predators, weather, hunger, and accidents. Pterosaur growth patterns and juvenile flight ability are debated across the group, but many pterosaurs may have been capable of flight relatively early compared with birds, which often require parental feeding and extended development. Whether giant Ashdarkid juveniles lived in the same habitats as adults or occupied different niches is not fully clear. If juveniles were much smaller, they may have eaten different prey and faced different dangers. The life of Quetzalcoatlus was probably not one ecological role from birth to death, but a changing series of roles as the animal grew. This matters because large animals are never just large animals. They are populations made of eggs, hatchlings, juveniles, subadults, adults, and old individuals. A giant adult might dominate small prey on a floodplain, while young individuals might be prey themselves. A species can be successful only if enough young survive long enough to replace adults. When we see the spectacular adult skeleton, we are looking at the endpoint of a long biological process. The real species included many smaller, more fragile stages that rarely become famous. The muscles of Quetzalcoatlus are also invisible in the fossil record, but they are essential to the story. Bones tell us where muscles attached and how forces may have moved through the body. For flight, the shoulder, chest, and forelimb system mattered enormously. The wing was not a passive sail. It needed active control, tension, adjustment, and power. A giant pterosaur in the air would have constantly responded to wind, body angle, wing shape, and speed. It may have made small corrections that no fossil can show. To fly is not merely to have wings. It is to control an unstable body in a moving fluid. That phrase, moving fluid, is important. Air feels empty to us when we stand still, but for flying animal it is a landscape. Rising warm air, sinking cool air, gusts, turbulence, crosswinds, and ground effect all matter. A giant pterosaur likely chose launch sites and flight times in relation to wind conditions. It may have preferred open areas, slopes, river corridors, or warm parts of the day where air currents helped. A creature this large could not be careless. It had to read the invisible geography of air, not with human thought, but with instinct, sensation, and evolved behavior. Ground effect may have helped during low flight, as wings moving close to the surface can gain some aerodynamic efficiency. Thermals may have helped during soaring. Ridge lift may have helped near topographic features. None of this means Quetzalcoatlus needed a runway or cliff in a modern engineering sense. It means flight behavior was probably tied to environmental opportunity. Large flyers today are often experts in using air rather than fighting it. Quetzalcoatlus may have been the same. A giant that survived not by brute flapping alone, but by cooperating with the atmosphere. The more we think about this, the less it resembles a monster movie, and the more it resembles a natural history film. A monster flies because the story needs it to fly. An animal flies because its anatomy, behavior, energy, budget, and environment make flight possible often enough to be useful. That is a much more interesting kind of wonder. It lets us ask not only how big Quetzalcoatlus was, but what kind of world could support such a flyer? The answer is a world with open spaces, prey resources, warm air, and ecosystems where a giant walking pterosaur could make a living. Its extinction closes the story, but not because Quetzalcoatlus failed. The end Cretaceous impact and its aftermath removed pterosaurs entirely, along with non-avian dinosaurs and many other forms of life. An animal can be beautifully adapted to one world and helpless in the next. If food webs collapse, climates shift, and reproductive habitats fail, even the most extraordinary body plan may not survive. Quetzalcoatlus was a masterpiece of the late Cretaceous, not a blueprint for all futures. Its body answered the questions its world asked. Then the world changed the questions. That is why it remains so compelling. Quetzalcoatlus sits at the border of the believable. It was tall enough to look a human in the eye from far above. It was wide enough in wingspan to dominate a room. It belonged to a lineage that had solved powered flight long before birds filled modern skies. Yet, it was also delicate in the larger sense, dependent on habitats, food webs, air, and reproduction. It was both giant and vulnerable. That combination gives the animal its emotional power. When a viewer asks whether Quetzalcoatlus ruled the skies, the best answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it was one of the most spectacular flying animals known, a supergiant pterosaur with a presence no living flyer can match. No, if ruled means invincible, constantly airborne, or above ecology. It did not rule like a king outside nature. It lived inside nature, bound by hunger, weather, injury, competition, and chance. Its greatness was not freedom from limits. Its greatness was existing at those limits. That is the story worth telling. Not a dragon, not a dinosaur, not a fantasy beast, but a real flying reptile whose body forces us to rethink what vertebrate flight can be. Quetzalcoatlus turns the sky from something familiar into something ancient and strange. It reminds us that Earth once produced flyers as tall as giraffes, walkers that could become wings, and ecosystems where the boundary between land and air was patrolled by giants. To understand it is not to make it smaller. To understand it is to see that reality was already larger than myth. And perhaps the most useful image is not the animal frozen in a museum pose, but the transition between states. On the ground, it is tall, angular, almost awkward to modern eyes. In launch, it becomes a burst of coordinated muscle and membrane. In the air, the awkwardness disappears, replaced by span, lift, and patience. It probably did not flap like a small bird or hover like a fantasy creature. It likely traveled by using the physics available to a giant: a powerful start, efficient wings, and the moving architecture of warm Cretaceous air. That image also helps us respect uncertainty. We can reconstruct the broad outline, but not every detail. We can say it was a pterosaur, an ashdarchid, a giant flyer, a capable walker, and probably a terrestrial forager of some kind. We can say it was not a dinosaur, not a bird, and not a dragon. We can say its fossils from Texas opened one of the most fascinating debates in vertebrate paleontology. But we should also leave room for future discoveries. A new skull, a trackway, a nesting site, or better soft tissue evidence could sharpen the picture. In science, even giants are unfinished stories. That is why Quetzalcoatlus still feels alive in the imagination. It is not fully solved, yet enough is known to make the mystery disciplined, visual, and scientifically thrilling for any prehistoric flight documentary. It remains strange, grounded, and unforgettable.